The first time I heard the pines speak my name, I told myself it was only the wind bending through the needles, but I knew better. In Olympic National Forest, the wind doesn't move like it does anywhere else. It creeps, it loops, it folds back on itself like it's thinking. And sometimes, when the dusk settles low and the moss starts glistening like wet fur, that wind sounds painfully close to a human breath. My name is Caleb, I'm 37, and I've been a ranger out here for more than a decade. Long enough to know the difference between an animal, a storm, and something that shouldn't be standing between the trees. Long enough to have a story that I don't tell the new rangers unless they're already pale enough from the daily briefings about missing hikers. Long enough to understand why some of the older locals around Quinault don't laugh when outsiders mention yetis or wood spirits. They just tighten their lips, look down at their coffee, and say something like, "Don't stay past twilight on the high trails." Nothing helpful, just enough to let you know you aren't as alone here as you pretend. Olympic is a strange kind of wild. The ground isn't just soil and roots, it's layers of memory. Moss thicker than your palm, stones older than anything that has a name. When visitors talk about the beauty of the forest, I nod and smile, but beauty is only the surface layer. Underneath is a pressure you can feel in your bones, like the forest is studying you, measuring you, deciding something. I used to shrug that off. When I first started, I was the proud type. Steady, logical, the kind of ranger who believed every scary story was just poor traction or bad weather or the echoing imagination of tourists who didn't know the difference between a cougar scream and wind through the rocks. But Olympic worked on me, the way it works on everyone who stays long enough. It sands down your certainty. It doesn't demand faith. It demands attention. And it started with a call from a pair of teenagers who were camping near the Bogachiel River. Just an ordinary disturbance call, the kind we get every week. Rustling outside their tent, heavy footsteps circling them around 2 a.m. They swore someone was out there, a big someone. At the time, I assumed it was a black bear, maybe a lost elk drifting lower than usual. I packed my gear, radioed dispatch, and headed out there before dawn. I parked a half-mile from their campsite and started walking. The sun wasn't fully up yet. The light was dim, filtered through heavy low clouds. The forest was quiet in a way it only gets right before a storm. No birds, no cracking branches, just the soft drip of dew sliding off ferns and landing on the ground in slow, deliberate taps. The kind of quiet that makes you feel observed. As I got closer to the site, I noticed the shape of the trees around the clearing. I wish I could describe it in a way that doesn't sound impossible. It wasn't that the trees themselves moved, they didn't. But there was a sense of them leaning in, subtly, like the forest was craning its neck to listen. The teenagers were waiting at the edge of the clearing, backpacks half-packed, eyes wide. The moment they saw me, they rushed toward me. "It walked around us," one said. "It breathed on the tent," the other added, like the air got sucked out. I tried to calm them, but one of them grabbed my arm and turned me toward the tree line. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I looked. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I realized the ferns, thick and waist-high, were flattened in a clean, sweeping trail, not trampled like a deer path, but crushed by something heavy that moved in a straight line around the camp. Not wandering, not curious, circling, claiming. I felt the first real tremor of unease ripple through me, the kind that starts in the stomach and spreads outward. "Black bear," I told them, though I didn't fully believe it. Bears wander. They don't trace perfect loops. I walked the perimeter, following the flattened ferns, analyzing the spacing. 10 feet wide. Whatever moved through here had a stride longer than mine. The prints, if you could call them prints, were sunken deep, deeper than an elk, but wider than a human foot. And the spacing, something wasn't right. That should have been enough for me to radio in backup. But pride is a strange kind of blindness. I didn't want to scare the kids further. I didn't want rumors spreading. And a part of me, some arrogant part left over from my first years on the job, wanted to prove to myself that I could explain whatever this was. It was only when I reached the northern edge of the loop that I saw the broken cedar sapling. 7 feet tall, snapped clean in half at chest height, like it was made of chalk. Not gnawed, not scratched, not blown by wind, just snapped. You don't see that often. And when you do, you don't forget it. Something inside me stiffened. I felt eyes on me. Not from the kids, not from any direction I could pinpoint, but from the forest itself. A heavy kind of watching, like a weight on the back of my neck. Behind me, one of the teens whispered, "Are you sure it was a bear?" I didn't answer. I radioed dispatch, told them to send a truck to escort the kids out, and stayed behind after they left. I knew I should have gone with them, but curiosity tugged at me the same way fear tugged. The forest had shown me something, and I felt wrongly that I needed to understand it. I walked another 30 yards beyond the broken cedar, following the direction the flattened trail continued. It led into deeper woods where light barely reached the ground. The moss thickened, the air cooled, and then, without warning, the trees grew still. Not quiet, still. A kind of stillness that feels intentional. I stopped walking. A shape stood between two massive firs about 40 feet ahead, too large to be a human, too upright to be an elk. I could only see the outline, broad shoulders, long arms, head nearly brushing a low branch. It wasn't moving. It wasn't hiding. It was simply there like it wanted me to see it. My throat tightened. Every instinct in my body screamed that whatever I was looking at wasn't meant to be understood in the way we understand deer or predators. It belonged to the forest in a way I didn't. I blinked, and the shape stepped back into the shadows without a sound. Not a branch snapping, not a footfall, nothing. I exhaled, and the breath trembled out of me. That was the morning my certainty cracked, but it wasn't the last time I'd see something like that. Olympic doesn't reveal everything at once. It tests you. It waits. It decides how much of the truth you're able to carry before it shows you the rest. And by the time the second story began, by the time the knocking on my cabin door started after midnight, I'd already used up every excuse that logic could offer. The first knock came 3 nights after the figure in the trees disappeared. Soft, deliberate, like someone tapping a single knuckle against wood. I remember sitting upright in bed before I was even fully awake, heart thumping with the cold realization that the sound hadn't come from a dream. My cabin sits alone up a narrow service road, a quarter-mile from the ranger station. Nobody wanders up there by accident, not in the middle of the night, not in that silence. I held my breath listening. Knock. Just once. Not loud. But it carried the way sound carries in a place without traffic, without neighbors, without anything but miles of old, waiting forest. I checked the clock. 12:47 a.m. Part of me wanted to write it off as an animal brushing the wall, a deer shifting its weight, a branch falling just right. But that wasn't what I heard. I know wood. I know the hollow resonance of a door being tested. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, its familiar weight grounding me. The room smelled faintly of damp cedar, a scent I normally found comforting. Not that night. It felt too sharp, like the forest had crept in through the cracks. I stood, moved quietly to the door, didn't turn on the lights. Something about the dark felt safer. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. Another knock didn't come. No footsteps either, just the long, slow silence of the woods breathing outside. I whispered to myself, "It's nothing. Just check." I eased open the curtain by an inch and looked out. Nothing. No shape. No movement. Only the moon brushing pale blue over the clearing. My cabin sits in a ring of tall cedars, their silhouettes stacked like dark ribs around the clearing. For the first time since I moved in, those trees looked too close, too eager to lean in. I shut the curtain and stepped away from the window. A familiar conflict stirred inside me, an old one I thought I'd buried years ago. I came to Olympic because the forest gave me quiet, and in that quiet I could outrun certain memories. The kind you collect when you've spent your early years letting fear dictate who you become. But fear has a strange way of circling back when you least expect it, wearing new faces, knocking on your door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I sat in the wooden chair by the front wall, flashlight across my lap, listening for footsteps. I heard none. But around 3 in the morning, the temperature dropped sharply, like someone had opened a door to a freezer. My breath misted gently in the glow of the flashlight. The heater kicked on, but the cold still clung to the floorboards. When dawn finally scraped its way through the blinds, I stepped outside. The air smelled wrong. It was faint, barely noticeable, but the forest usually smells like earth, moss, wet wood. That morning held something sour beneath it all, something metallic, like a tool left out in the rain. My boot steps echoed too loudly on the porch, as if the woods were holding their breath. I circled the cabin. That's when I saw it, pressed into the soft soil near the back corner of the house. A print. Not a human print, not a boot, but not pawed like a bear's either. It was long, wide. The pads were indistinct, almost melted into the ground, like something heavy had pressed straight through the mud without shifting its weight. The edges were crisp, and there was only one. No trail leading toward it. None leading away. Just the single, deep mark, as if something had stood very still and listened. I crouched, touched the edge with my fingers. The soil was still firm cold, not from the night, from pressure, as if the weight had pushed deep enough to unsettle the warmth beneath. A memory tugged at me then. My training officer years ago, an older ranger named Hale, telling me in a low voice, "The forest shows you footprints only when it wants you to know you're being followed." I brushed it off at the time. Hale was one of those men who carried too many stories in his eyes, the kind who spent years patrolling high ridges alone, listening to locals talk in half-truths over diner coffee. But that morning, kneeling in the cold mud, I remembered his tone. He wasn't joking. The unease from the teenager's campsite returned, sharper this time. I took a step back, pulled out my radio, thumb hovering over the button. But saying it out loud felt like crossing a threshold I wasn't ready for. Instead, I reported a vague disturbance and requested a routine patrol sweep. Nothing that would make me sound like I was losing grip on reality. The rest of the morning passed quietly, too quietly. Even the ravens stayed away, and ravens are never quiet in Olympic. Every time the wind brushed the treetops, I felt it like a breath on the back of my neck. By the time evening approached, a knot had formed low in my gut. I tried to rationalize it as fatigue, but it settled deeper with each passing minute. Around 6, I drove down to the Quinault outpost. The small wooden building sat warm in the glow of the porch lanterns. A few hikers signed permits. A couple local volunteers sorted gear. The normalcy should have calmed me. Instead, stepping inside felt like stepping into a different world entirely. One with rules, with walls, with the illusion of safety. I poured coffee and stood near the back wall, trying to steady myself. That's when one of the older volunteers, a woman named Lorna, glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Rough night?" she asked. I shrugged. "Didn't sleep well." She nodded slowly, but her eyes didn't leave mine. "Wind was strange last night," she said. "Carried voices farther than usual." My blood cooled. "Voices?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, looked at the floor. Then she said something I wish she hadn't. "Sometimes the old spirits walk close to the timberline when the fog hangs low. Folks around here used to say they knock to see who's awake." She said it plainly, without drama, like she was reciting weather patterns. I forced a laugh. "People still say stuff like that?" Instead of answering, she set her coffee down, looked at me with a sincerity that cut deeper than fear. "Caleb, I've lived here all my life. My father before me, his father before him. We don't say those things for fun. If something knocks, you don't open the door." Her seriousness made something tighten behind my ribs. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was warning me the way someone warns a person not to step on a weak patch of ice. I left earlier than usual that night, the unease settling back to my joints like cold rain. The drive to my cabin felt longer than it should have. The headlights swept across the trees, catching glimpses of pale moss and the occasional shine of animal eyes in the underbrush. But what unsettled me most wasn't what I could see. It was what I couldn't. The darkness between the trunks felt thicker, like something was standing still just beyond the reach of the beams. By the time I reached the clearing, night had consumed the sky. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. The forest smelled normal again, but that didn't comfort me. Sometimes silence is the loudest warning. I locked the truck, walked up the porch, and paused at the door. The air felt heavy, expectant. Inside, I left the lights off and settled into the same wooden chair by the wall. I didn't intend to stay awake, but I knew I would. The knocking came again, this time 3 slow taps, not scattered, not confused, rhythmic, intentional. I froze. My throat tightened, my lungs refusing to pull in air. The sound was soft, but it vibrated through the wood with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Then, after a long, terrible pause, a 4th sound came. Not a knock, a breath, warm, damp, pressing against the door's thin seam like something enormous was leaning in. And on the other side, a voice barely above a whisper spoke my name. Not Caleb, my childhood name. A name I hadn't heard in 20 years. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud since the night my older brother died. I hadn't let anyone use it since. It belonged to a different version of me, one who flinched at shadows, one who froze when fear arrived. I buried that name deep, as if losing the word could sever the memory. But something outside my cabin door had found it, and hearing it again, spoken so close I could feel the syllables press into the wood, hit me with a kind of raw terror I'd never felt in the forest before. I didn't move, couldn't. My muscles locked as if the sound itself pinned me down. My eyes burned, my breath shallow. I felt 12 years old again, kneeling on the cold floor of a hospital hallway, listening to an officer explain that my brother had wandered off during a camping trip, that he'd been found too late, that sometimes the woods take before they give. That name was a wound, not a word, and whatever was outside had reached inside me and touched the most vulnerable part. The voice didn't repeat it. The breath lingered for several seconds more, steady, controlled, before retreating with a slow exhale that felt like a curtain of warm air brushing my legs through the crack under the door. Then everything went still. No footsteps walking away, no rustling, no shifting weight on the porch, just silence folding back into itself. I waited what felt like hours before standing. Every instinct screamed not to look outside. I resisted the urge to touch the doorknob, afraid it might feel warm from where something had leaned its face against it. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the door. When the first blade of morning light touched the window, I finally stepped outside. The air felt normal. Birds called out. The earth smelled like wet needles again. For a moment, I wondered if it really happened. Then I saw the marks, not tracks, not footprints. At eye level on the door, 4 long vertical streaks in the wood, as if fingers, human or not, had dragged slowly down the surface. The grooves were shallow but unmistakable. I touched one and felt the splintered grain catch my skin. I paced the porch, scanning the clearing. That's when I saw another print, this one deeper, more defined than the first. Still oversized, still wrong, but now there were 2. The second sat halfway between the porch and the tree line, as if whatever stood at my door had backed away, paused, then stepped into the thicker brush. And something about the spacing chilled me more than the prints themselves. Whatever left them stood nearly 9 feet tall. I crouched, running my hand through the cold indentation. There was no melting, no sliding, no evidence of hesitation. Whatever it was, man, creature, spirit, it walked with a confidence that didn't belong to anything prey-like. I stood abruptly, fighting the rising panic. My throat felt tight, my breath thin. I grabbed my radio, forced my voice steady enough to call in. I told dispatch a large animal had been near my cabin, asked for a wildlife sweep of the area. They asked if it was a bear. I hesitated an instant too long. Then I lied. Probably, I said. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher quietly said, "You don't sound sure." I didn't answer. A team arrived within an hour. I walked them through the clearing, keeping my voice even, but I didn't show them the fingerprints on the door. I couldn't make myself. Those grooves felt too personal, too intentional. Evidence, yes, but also intimate in a way that made my stomach twist. When the team left, I told myself the worst had passed, that whatever knocked the night before might not return, that maybe it was curiosity, just curiosity. But that wasn't the truth, and part of me knew it. The forest remembers your fear, and once something finds it, it doesn't forget. I worked the next 2 days in a fog of exhaustion. The patrols, the trail checks, the paperwork, all of it passed through me like I was half here, half elsewhere. The other rangers noticed my distraction. One joked that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. If only it were that simple. The third night after the knocking, fog swallowed the forest early, rolling in thick waves through the trees. Olympic fog is different. Heavy, clingy, muffling sound until even your own breaths feel damp. I tried to sleep despite the dread curling through my gut. It wasn't the knocking that woke me. It was the sound of something massive moving through the brush behind the cabin. Not fast, not clumsy, controlled and close. Branches creaked, moss tore. The weight of each step made the ground subtly shift beneath the floorboards. Then came the breathing. Slow, deep inhalations, wet, animalistic, followed by the faint rasp of something dragging across bark. I sat frozen in bed, heart hammering so hard it hurt. The walls felt thin enough to push through with one hand. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay still, stay silent, stay small. So I did. Minutes stretched endlessly. The breathing moved along the wall, stopping near the bedroom window. I shut my eyes, praying for it to pass. Then the whisper came. Not a voice this time. A sound like a throat trying to mimic human speech. Low, gravelly, trying to form a shape that wasn't natural to it. Not words. Just the cadence of them. A rhythm familiar enough to send a shudder through me. It was trying to speak, trying to call me again. But not with my old name. With my brother's. Hearing it, the way the syllables cracked unnaturally, hit me harder than the knocking ever could. I felt the air leave my lungs in a strangled gasp. I wanted to shout, to deny it, to break whatever tether the forest had tied between my past and this moment, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. A scraping noise followed, the slow drag of something across the house's siding. It paused beneath the window. I could feel its awareness pressing through the glass, a weight like heat aimed directly at me. Then the breathing shifted. It inhaled sharply, as if scenting something. My fear, my memory. The part of me I thought I had buried. Something primal awoke inside me. The same instinct I felt the day my brother died, when the world didn't make sense anymore, when something irrevocable snapped inside. And that old wound flared in a way I hadn't felt in decades, tearing open under the weight of this new presence. I forced myself to sit up, forced myself to look toward the window. A shadow shifted behind the fogged glass, tall, hunched, enormous shoulders rising and falling with each breath. I couldn't see its face. I didn't want to. But something leaned close enough that the condensation on the glass trembled with each exhale. Then, with a sudden, violent thud, the window pane bowed inward. Not breaking, not cracking, just testing. My entire body recoiled. The shadow didn't move. It stood there, breathing, patient, waiting for weakness, waiting for recognition. Finally, after what felt like forever, it stepped back. The floorboards stopped vibrating. The breathing faded. And the forest swallowed whatever it was whole, leaving only silence behind. I stayed awake until sunrise. When I stepped outside, the fog had receded. A few birds chirped hesitantly. Everything looked normal. But normal is just a disguise the forest wears when it wants you to doubt yourself. Then I saw the trail. Deep impressions leading from the back wall into the trees. A path carved not by feet but by weight. Massive weight. The spacing was uneven. Like whatever moved had to lower itself or crawl or shift in some strange, unnatural gait. And halfway down the trail, snagged on a branch, hung a strip of fabric. Blue, faded. The same color as the jacket my brother wore the night he disappeared. My legs nearly gave out. I reached for it with shaking hands. But as my fingers grazed it, something moved deeper among the pines, slow, heavy, deliberate, as if waiting, as if watching me claim the memory it had stolen. For a long moment, I just stood there staring at that strip of faded blue fabric clinging to the branch. My breath trembled out in uneven bursts, the cold air burning the back of my throat. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to confirm the fear rising inside me, the terrible possibility unfolding like rot beneath bark. But I did. The fabric was stiff, weather-worn, frayed around the edges. It was old, years old. I rubbed it between my fingers, and a wave of emotion surged through me so hard my vision blurred. I held that jacket once, the night they let me see it after they found my brother. Same shade, same stitching, same tear near the hem. I had memorized every inch of it because I was too afraid to look at anything else. That jacket became the last piece of him I could stand to touch. Someone shouldn't have had this. Something shouldn't have had this. I looked down the trail of deep impressions leading into the darker stretch of forest. They weren't shaped like footprints. They were distortions in the earth. Like the soil had been crushed under something too heavy and too strange to belong to the world I understood. And they disappeared into a narrow cleft between two towering firsts, an entrance into thicker shadow. I felt the pull immediately, not curiosity, something deeper, something that felt like a hand gripping the center of my chest, tugging me forward. My brother had disappeared in a forest not unlike this one. They never found a body, just signs of a struggle, a torn jacket, and a sheriff repeating phrases about misadventure and wrong place, wrong time. I stopped believing those words when I was 14. And now, decades later, something was showing me a road I thought had been sealed shut forever. A part of me resisted. A voice inside pleaded to go back, call for backup, report the evidence, stay safe. But another voice, quieter, older, buried deep inside, told me there are moments when you don't choose the path. The path chooses you. So I followed. The air shifted as soon as I passed between the two firsts. Sound dulled to a dim murmur, as if the forest waited for me to take each step before deciding how to respond. Moss hung in thick curtains from the branches above. The smell of the earth deepened, richer, sweeter, tinged with a faint metallic scent that made the hairs on my arms rise. The impressions in the soil grew farther apart, as though the thing that made them had begun to move faster, dragging its weight through the underbrush. I stepped carefully, listening. Every now and then I heard something ahead. Branches shifting, stones rolling, a breath that didn't belong to wind. Each sound felt like a message. You're close. You're expected. I should have turned back. By the time I realized how far I'd gone, the clearing was out of sight. The trail behind me had already begun to disguise itself, moss reshaping over my footprints. The forest has ways of deciding what gets remembered and what gets lost. But I kept going, driven by something sharp and unyielding inside me, something like grief, but older and heavier. After 20 minutes, the impressions stopped, just stopped mid-stride in a shallow depression. The forest around me was silent. No birds, no distant river, just the faint rustle of needles falling from a branch above. I knelt beside the last print. The air felt colder here, pressing against my skin like a damp hand. I looked deeper into the trees, searching for any sign of movement. And that's when I saw it. A cave. The opening yawned from the side of a moss-covered slope 30 yards ahead. I had walked these woods for over 10 years. I knew every ridge, every outcrop, every marked cave. This one wasn't on any map. It wasn't supposed to be here, yet it waited, black and wide like a wound in the earth. The smell drifting out was faint but unmistakable. Cold stone, wet soil, and something underneath, something metallic like old blood. I felt my heartbeat shift from my chest to my throat. Everything in me screamed to stop, but the forest seemed to lean in behind me, closing any imagined escape. And beneath that weight, the cry of my childhood self whispered through my mind. Don't leave him again. I swallowed hard and approached the cave. The entrance was taller than a person and arched and uneven, as if carved by hands that didn't understand symmetry. Faint marks lined the sides, scrapes, gouges, long grooves that mirrored the streaks on my cabin door. I stepped inside, the temperature dropping instantly. My breath fogged the air. The cave walls glistened with condensation, catching the faint beams of daylight that stretched only a foot or two beyond the entrance. I clicked on my flashlight. Its beam pierced the darkness, shaking slightly in my trembling hand. The cave sloped down, narrow at first, then widening into a chamber. My boots crunched over scattered rocks and damp soil. Every sound echoed too long, as though the cave wanted to hold on to each noise, stretch it, absorb it. The deeper I went, the stronger the metallic scent became. Then my light landed on something ahead. Cloth. Torn, faded, blue. I staggered forward, breath shaking, and lifted the ragged piece from the floor. Another corner of the same jacket. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I turned, scanning the area. More scraps lay scattered, some half buried in mud, others caught on jagged rock. But no bones, no remains, only pieces. A sudden scrape echoed to my left. Loud, close. I spun, flashlight jerking hard to illuminate the source. The beam landed on a figure, not fully revealed, only a shoulder, a curve of something massive, covered not in fur exactly, but in something matted and dark. The shape twitched, as if startled by the light. Then an arm, longer than any human limb, shifted slightly, claws or fingers curling against the rock. My breath halted. The figure wasn't standing, it was crouching. And even crouched, it nearly brushed the cave ceiling. Something deep within the cave exhaled, a slow, heavy breath. The kind of breath a thing takes when it knows you've finally stepped into the place it wanted you. I stumbled back, feet skidding on loose gravel. The flashlight beam trembled wildly across the cave walls. Then the creature moved. Not lunging, not attacking. It stepped forward, slow, deliberate, as though emerging from a decades-old hiding place. Its outline filled the space, shoulders broad, limbs long, head lowered. I couldn't make out its face, only the suggestion of it, shadowed, but watching. It inhaled again, and in a guttural, fractured tone, like stone grinding against stone, it attempted to form a sound. A name, not mine, my brother's, the same broken mimicry I heard outside the window. Hearing it in the cave, hearing it echo, nearly shattered me. I staggered backward, heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. I slipped on the wet stone and hit the ground hard, flashlight tumbling out of my hand and rolling toward the creature. And that's when I saw it. Not the creature, not its face, but the wall behind it. Carvings, dozens, maybe hundreds, pairs of marks, scratches, lines, symbols etched into the stone, some old, faded with time, some recent, sharp enough the dust still clung to the edges. Each pair was different, but all carried the same shape, 2 slashes side by side, a tally, a count, not of animals, not of territory marks, but victims, people taken, people who never came back. The realization hit like ice water. The cave wasn't a home, it was a ledger, a record, a graveyard without bones. A sound rose from deep inside the creature's chest, not a roar, but a low, mournful groan, a sound of old hunger or old grief. I backed away, scrambling blindly toward the entrance, legs numb with terror. The creature didn't chase, it only watched, as if deciding whether I belonged among the marks on the cave wall. When I reached daylight, I didn't stop running. Branches tore at my arms, rocks bruised my knees, but I didn't feel any of it. I ran until my cabin came into view, until my lungs burned, until I collapsed in the clearing and gasped air like it was salvation. Behind me, the forest stood silent, too silent, as if it had made its decision. I didn't go back to the cave. I reported nothing. Not the prints, not the fabric, not the whispers, not the creature. Some truths bury you once spoken. In the years since, hikers have still gone missing. Locals still whisper about spirits, giants, guardians, monsters, and every so often, when the fog settles and the pines lean close, I swear I hear a slow breath outside my cabin door. Sometimes it knocks, sometimes it waits, but it never uses my childhood name anymore. Now it uses my brother's, because whatever lives beneath the pines remembers the ones it takes, and it never gives them back. The first time I heard the pines breathe, I thought it was just the wind catching itself between the ridgelines, but something in the way the branches shuddered made the sound feel too close, too deliberate, like the forest had just woken up and was clearing its throat before deciding what to do with me. That moment still returns in fragments. cold air pressing against my back, the faint metallic taste of fear rising in my mouth, and the sudden understanding that not every story locals whisper is meant to scare visitors. Some are warnings wrapped in superstition, and some are promises the woods intend to keep. My name's Mason, and I'm 43 years old, though the mountains have a way of making any age feel trivial. I work as a ranger in the central stretch of the Clearwater Pines, a place big enough that you can hike 10 hours in any direction and still end up somewhere people only talk about in past tense. The locals will tell you the forest has moods, almost like a living thing, comforting when it wants you calm, silent when it wants you blind, loud when it wants you gone. And if you stay long enough, you learn its language, whether you want to or not. I didn't grow up here. I came from a flat little town where the horizon was a straight line, and the only real danger was boredom. Maybe that's why I became a ranger, to feel something bigger than myself, to be part of a place where nature still had the upper hand. And for a while, it was everything I hoped for. Quiet mornings, crisp air, trails that wound between ancient trees, the kind of solitude people pay money to pretend they're comfortable with. But peace in the woods is deceptive, because the forest doesn't show you what it holds all at once. It peels back its layers slowly, like it wants to see how much silence you can endure before breaking. And the first story I ever experienced out here, the one that still trembles at the edge of my dreams, began with a knock. Not on a door, not on a tree, but on my cabin window, miles from any campground, in a place where no one walks after sunset. It was early autumn back then. The nights came quick, and the temperature had a way of sinking before you realized the sun was gone. I had just settled in after a long patrol, boots off, jacket hung near the stove, the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones hum. My cabin was small, just a single-bedroom structure deep in the patrol zone, not meant for guests or comfort. The walls were thin enough to hear the world outside breathing, and that night, the world wasn't breathing right. The first knock came soft, almost polite. 2 taps, then silence. I remember sitting upright without knowing I had moved, every sense narrowing to the window on the far wall. I told myself it was probably a branch, maybe a falling cone, something ordinary. Still, something in me hesitated, some instinct older than language. Then came the second knock. Not harder, not louder, but closer. More intentional, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted to see if I would answer. I didn't move. Not at first. I just listened, the way you listen when you're trying to distinguish between imagination and danger. The stove crackled behind me. The wind rattled the gutters. And under all of it, the faintest scrape, a dragging sound against the wood paneling outside, as though fingers were tracing the structure from one side to the other. I reached for my flashlight, not because it would help much through the window, but because holding something grounded me. Light has that effect on the mind. It makes you think you're in control. I stood, stepped slowly toward the window, and angled the beam. All I could see were shapes, the silhouette of tall pines, the slope leading down toward the ravine, the edge of the clearing where my patrol truck sat dark and quiet. Nothing looked disturbed. But the forest was listening. You can feel when that happens. The air gets heavier, not colder, just weighted, like you're standing under 1,000 unseen eyes. That night was the first time I felt that shift, and it rooted me in place. I waited, listened, told myself to breathe. Then came the third knock. This one wasn't soft, it wasn't polite. It hit the glass with a dull thud that made the pain tremble in its frame. And my blood went cold, not because something was out there, but because I knew, absolutely knew, that the knock had come from halfway up the window. Too high for a person unless they were standing on something. Too smooth and too flat to be an animal paw, and too deliberate to be wind or debris. I stepped back. My throat tightened. My hand shook enough that the flashlight beam jittered across the floor. And then, just as quickly as the knocking had started, the forest went still. Not quiet, still. No breeze, no crickets, No shifting branches, just a silence so complete it pressed against my ears like pressure underwater. I waited for something else to happen. Another knock, a shadow, a sound. But the moment just stretched on and on until the stillness became worse than the knocking had been. It took me 15 minutes to gather the courage to open the door, and even then, I only cracked it a few inches. The night air rushed in, sharp and cold, and for a second I thought I saw movement near the tree line. Something tall, something pale. But the moment I blinked, it was gone. I stepped outside anyway because fear doesn't get to make decisions out here. Not when you're responsible for the safety of others. My boots crunched on the frosted grass as I swept my flashlight across the clearing. Nothing, no footprints, no dragged branches, no signs of wildlife. The window itself had no marks, no scratches, no dents. But the scent in the air was wrong. It smelled faintly like wet stone, cold mineral, something like the inside of a cave right after a flood. A scent that doesn't belong in a pine forest perched high above the valley floor. A scent that made my stomach tighten with a memory I didn't understand at the time. I stood there, shivering more from unease than cold, telling myself I had imagined the entire thing. That exhaustion had made me jumpy, that the knocking was probably a pine cone bouncing off the glass in the wind. But the forest wasn't buying my excuses, and deep down I wasn't either. I slept little that night. Every creak of the cabin, every shifting shadow between the trees felt like a warning I couldn't decipher. By dawn, my nerves were raw, and the scent of wet stone still clung faintly to the air, as if whatever had been out there had lingered long after it disappeared. That was my introduction to the pines. Not a warm welcome, not a gentle initiation, but a reminder that this land had rules I didn't yet understand. And if I wanted to survive out here, I would need to learn fast. But the knocking wasn't the last strange thing that happened. It was only the first whisper, and whispers have a way of becoming voices. The weeks that followed blurred together in that strange way time behaves when you're running on half rest and too much adrenaline. I told myself the knocking had been a one-time thing, a weird night, a trick of temperature shifting the cabin frame, maybe even some overconfident wildlife using the window as a scratching post. That last explanation was ridiculous, but I leaned on it anyway. Sometimes the mind chooses the lie that hurts the least. But the forest wasn't done with me. If anything, the trees seemed to watch me more closely afterward, as if waiting for proof that I understood what that first encounter meant. And every patrol shift after sunset felt heavier. The shadows pooled deeper. The wind spoke in tones that felt almost too structured to be weather alone. Around that time, I started spending more evenings at the outpost near Wolf's Crest, a local rest stop disguised as a ranger supply shed. Truth was, it gave me an excuse to talk with the older rangers, the ones who never volunteered their stories but also never denied them. Men and women who had walked these trails long before I arrived and carried a look in their eyes that said the forest had taken a piece of each of them. One of them, Pete, a ranger in his 60s who moved like he carried a lifetime of secrets in his joints, was the kind who spoke in fragments. Not because he was hiding something, but because he wasn't sure if saying it aloud made it more real. We'd share coffee on the steps after long shifts, watching the sky bruise from cobalt to black. One night I mentioned the scent I'd smelled, the wet stone that didn't belong up here. Pete didn't look at me right away. He just tapped the ash off his cigarette, squinted at the tree line, and muttered, "Yeah, that's one of the signs." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer at first. He just inhaled slow, held it, then exhaled through his nose like the memory of whatever he was about to say carried a weight he didn't want to set down. "When the air smells like rock after rain," he murmured, "something old is walking." That phrasing sat unnervingly soft between us. Something old. The kind of word choice that could pass as folklore, if not for the way he said it. Calm, steady, resigned. I pressed him gently, but he shook his head. "Not my story to tell," he said. I hated when he said that. It felt like the forest itself had taught him silence. Instead, he gave me advice the way he always did, indirectly. Stay out of the cave systems before winter, he said, especially the ones on the North Ridge. Some places get cold before the weather does. That didn't make much sense to me then, but I would come to understand it with a level of clarity I wish I never earned. For the next few days, I focused on regular patrols, trail checks, campsite inspections, verifying that hunters stayed where they were licensed to be. The usual. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to the Knox. But the forest had a way of nudging me toward the truth, whether I wanted it or not. The second story began on a night colder than it should have been. A sudden drop, sharp, needle-like, the kind that bites the skin rather than chills it, the kind that makes animals go silent all at once, as if something in the air whispered danger before I heard it myself. I was halfway through an evening patrol when that cold spread across the trail like a fog with no visible source. I stopped walking. My breath came out in a white plume I wasn't expecting, and the sound around me thinned into a kind of metallic ring, subtle but present, like the air was resonating with a vibration below hearing range. The first sound I noticed was a faint crunching behind me. I turned, expecting maybe a deer or a wandering elk, but the trail was empty. The beam of my flashlight stretched long across the frost-dusted dirt, revealing nothing but pines and the soft drift of falling needles. Then the wind shifted, not in a regular gust, not in a natural swirl. It moved in a tightly focused push, brushing against the back of my neck as if passing deliberately behind me, and with it came that smell again. Wet stone, cold and heavy, the scent of a subterranean world that didn't belong above ground. I held my breath, and that's when I heard it. A groan, deep, distant, but unmistakably real, echoing from somewhere north, farther up the ridge. It wasn't an animal call. It wasn't wind scraping through the hollows. It sounded like the earth itself was trying to speak through a throat clogged with centuries of dust. I radioed the outpost, keeping my tone professional despite the spike of fear rising in my chest. Something about that sound felt wrong enough that I didn't want to be near it alone, but the nearest ranger was still 30 minutes away. Procedure meant I had to investigate first. The path up the ridge was narrow and steep, with exposed roots that snagged at my boots as I climbed. The air around me grew colder the higher I went, colder than any map indicated it should be. My ears started ringing, not painfully, but persistently, like the pressure was changing. Halfway up, the trees opened into a small clearing, a natural bowl where the moonlight pooled in a pale circle, and there, in the center of it, was the source of the groan. A hole. Not a simple erosion pit, not a den, not a landslide cavity. A perfectly round opening in the ground, no wider than a truck tire, descending into a darkness so absolute it looked like the earth had swallowed the night itself. The dirt around its lip was packed tight, as if something large had pressed its weight onto the surface recently. I crouched near the edge, shining my light down. The beam vanished after only a few feet. No reflection, no rock glint, no gradual fade. It simply disappeared, swallowed whole. My skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched, from below. Something about that darkness felt aware, almost sentient, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Then the smell intensified, wet stone and something faintly organic, like moss left too long in stagnant water. I leaned closer. That's when the first breath rose out of the hole. Not warm air from below, not geothermal heat. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like opening a freezer in the dead of winter. It washed against my face, numbing my cheeks. And beneath the cold was a whisper. Not words, not a voice, more like the sound of something massive shifting far, far below the surface. I staggered back, heart pounding. And that's when I saw them. Tracks. Large, humanoid, but wrong in shape, longer than any human foot, narrower at the heel, marked with subtle ridges that suggested something more like layered bone than flesh. They led from the trees to the hole, and then stopped, as if whatever made them had either entered the earth or emerged from it. I felt a tremor of dread climb up my spine, so visceral it almost buckled my knees. The radio crackled suddenly, loud enough to make me jump. "Mason, you still there? Report." I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to steady. "Found something on the north ridge, a cavity in the ground. Tracks nearby. Odd scent. Potential cave-in hazard." Calling it that was easier than admitting the truth. "Copy that. Stay put. We're en route." But even as I clipped the radio back to my vest, I knew in my gut I couldn't stay by that hole. The forest didn't want me there. The cold air pressed against me harder, almost nudging me backward. And the whispering from the darkness below was growing louder. Still unintelligible, but taking shape, forming rhythm. I stepped away slowly, flashlight held tight. There are moments in a ranger's life when instinct screams louder than training. This was one of them. I turned and started down the ridge, but before I made it 10 steps, the groan came again. This time so close it vibrated the ground beneath my feet. A deep, pulsing rumble like a giant exhaling after centuries of rest. The forest shuddered. Every tree bent ever so slightly toward the hole as if pulled by some invisible force. And for the first time since becoming a ranger, I felt the absolute certainty that I was not meant to witness what lived beneath these pines. I didn't run. Running makes noise. Running wakes things. Instead, I moved fast but controlled, my breath sharp at the edges, my heartbeat thundering against the quiet. But halfway down the trail, I froze. Something was standing on the path ahead, tall, still, watching. And when it stepped forward, the ground beneath its weight let out the same cold groan as the earth. It stood there without moving, tall enough that its head nearly grazed a hanging limb of the nearest pine. For a moment, I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the darkness or an actual figure blocking the trail. My flashlight beam wavered across its shape, catching only fragments. Broad shoulders, a bowed head, long arms that dangled lower than they should have, and fur thick enough to appear matted with moisture. It wasn't the shape of any animal in this forest, but it also wasn't the silhouette of a man. And the way it breathed, the faint rise and fall of something heavy but controlled, told me it was very much alive. The forest held still, as if listening to the two of us measure each other in that narrow slice of trail. I remember the tightness in my throat, the way my body wanted to turn back toward the ridge despite the pit waiting behind me, not forward, not backward. Fear had locked every muscle, as if my own instincts didn't trust me with control. The creature finally shifted, not aggressively, not even quickly. Just a slow lean, like someone adjusting their weight before stepping out of a shadow. And as its body angled toward the light, I caught a glimpse of something I'm still not sure my mind fully understands. Its fur wasn't just wet, it glistened. Not with water. With thin streaks of clay-like mud, the same color as the sediment near old cave systems. The same smell of wet stone rolled off it in waves, the smell from the hole. Whatever this thing was, it had come from below. I didn't raise my weapon, didn't shout, didn't try to run. Some deep instinct told me that noise, any noise, would make things far worse. Instead, I held the flashlight at my side, its beam angling down toward the dirt between us, not into its face. The creature inhaled again, a long, deliberate breath that expanded its chest with a sound like air scraping through old tunnels. And then, slowly, it took one step toward me. That single movement made my pulse spike so hard I felt it behind my eyes. But it didn't charge. Instead, it lowered itself, sinking slightly at the knees, almost as if studying me. Not curious the way animals are. Intentional. Measuring. Its head tilted with a kind of intelligence that made my stomach drop. Then its gaze, deep-set, dark, reflective, shifted from me to the ridge behind me, toward the circular pit I just left. It knew I had been near it. It could smell the cold breath of the underground on my clothes. A low rumble traveled through its chest, vibrating the air. Not a growl, not a warning. Something else, something closer to recognition or disapproval. The hairs on my arms stood straight, not from the cold, but from the sensation that this thing wasn't deciding whether to attack. It was deciding whether I had trespassed. Without thinking, I stepped back. A small movement, but even that felt dangerous. The creature lifted its head a fraction, and the rumbling stopped. For the first time, I noticed how oddly still the forest remained around us. No wind, no settling branches. Even the stars above felt frozen in place, as if the whole world was waiting for our next move. Then the creature slowly reached one elongated arm toward a branch above its head, curling its fingers. The length of them rivaled small knives around the thin limb. It broke the branch cleanly, the crack startlingly soft for something so thick. It then dropped the branch onto the trail between us, a boundary, my boundary, a warning that stepping over it was an invitation to something final. That's when the radio on my shoulder crackled again. "Mason, we're 10 minutes out." The creature reacted instantly. It didn't roar, didn't attack. It simply straightened, turned its body toward the deeper woods, and this part still unnerves me, merged into the darkness between the pines with almost no sound. Not running, not panicked, purposeful, certain, like it knew the forest would hide it as willingly as it had revealed it. Then it was gone, just gone. Not a twig snapped, not a branch swayed. The woods swallowed it whole. The only proof I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing was the snapped branch on the dirt, still swaying slightly from where it had landed. When the other rangers arrived, they found me standing in the trail, flashlight down, eyes still locked on the place the creature had disappeared. They didn't question my shock. They could see it. But when I told them what I saw, describing only the shape and the size, using words like upright and large, their faces didn't twist with disbelief. They went still. Pete arrived last, his breath ragged from climbing the ridge faster than a man his age should. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he shined his light at the broken branch, then scanned the tree line with a familiar dread. "You saw it," he said quietly. Not a question. I nodded. He exhaled through clenched teeth, shaking his head slightly, not out of disbelief, but out of some internal confirmation, like a piece of a puzzle he didn't want solved had just dropped into place. "We need to leave," he muttered. "Now." The others obeyed without hesitation, but as we moved back down the trail, Pete stayed near me, walking with a pace that made his anxiety obvious. "Don't talk about this over the radio," he whispered, "and don't go back to that ridge alone, especially not to the hole." I wanted answers. I wanted to know what I'd seen, what it was, where it came from, how long the rangers had known something lived beneath these mountains. But Pete walked in silence, eyes keyed to every shadow, every shift in the undergrowth. He wasn't afraid of being overheard by wildlife. He was afraid of being overheard by whatever had watched me on the trail. Back at the outpost, the others exchanged quiet glances and whispered theories, the kind of talk seasoned rangers used only when they knew the night wasn't done with them. Pete guided me inside, poured coffee with trembling hands, and locked the door behind us. "Listen carefully," he said, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "There are things in these woods older than any map, older than any tribe's story, older than the trees themselves. Most of the time they stay underground. They follow their own paths, but sometimes they wake, sometimes they come up, especially when the ground shifts." He hesitated, then added, "especially before winter." My pulse kicked hard at that word. Winter here was brutal, deep, long. If something below was becoming active before the season, that meant whatever lived down there wasn't hibernating, it was rising. "What did I see?" I asked. Pete's eyes met mine, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear. Not just caution, not respect for the woods, but real human fear. "The old ones," he said, "or one of them. Folks have different names, cave walkers, hollow giants, ridge spirits. Doesn't matter. Whatever you call them, they notice when someone steps too close to their places." He paused. "And that hole you found? That wasn't a cave-in. Those don't open clean. Something made it." Made it. The word hit me like a blow. The hole had been perfect, smooth, round, intentional. "But why appear to me?" I asked. "If it wanted to kill me, it could have." Pete nodded slowly. "If it wanted you dead, you wouldn't be here to ask." His voice softened. "It wasn't hunting you. It was warning you." My stomach tightened. "Warning me of what?" His answer came after a long, heavy silence. "That you're getting close to something you shouldn't." I sat back, absorbing that. The cold smell, the breath from the pit, the footprints, the creature. It all connected in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. But Pete wasn't done. He leaned closer, lowering his voice even further. There's another story you need to hear. Something that happened years ago before you started. Because I know, it's starting again. My throat tightened. What happened? Pete swallowed hard, eyes dropping to the coffee in his hands. A ranger went missing, he said. Not on duty, not during patrol. In his own cabin. Only thing they found was the scent of cold stone and a footprint shaped just like the one you saw. The room felt suddenly smaller. What was his name? I whispered. Pete raised his eyes, and the fear in them told me the truth before he said it. He didn't have a name we used, he murmured. We just called him the one who looked too deep. He let out a slow breath. And Mason, you're starting to look the same. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid of dreaming, but because I didn't want to close my eyes long enough for the forest to seep into my thoughts. There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't make you tired, just hollow. Like your nerves have been pulled tight through your body and every sound around you vibrates along them. That's how I felt sitting in Pete's outpost. The dim light flickering against the windows, the smell of burnt coffee drifting through the room. Pete stayed awake with me, pacing more than sitting, rubbing his palms together as though trying to generate warmth from nothing. When dawn finally touched the ridgeline, he stopped pacing, stared out the window, and said softly, "You need to hear the rest of it." I didn't want to, but the part of me that had already stepped beyond safety, the part that had heard the groan of the earth and seen the creature blocking the trail, knew there was no turning back. He took his time, gathering his thoughts like someone assembling tools before a dangerous task. It was 22 years ago, he began. Late fall. Nights were longer. Snow was coming early that year. His voice dropped into a tone I'd never heard from him. Regret, worn thin by time but not erased. We had a ranger named Holt. Quiet man, kept to himself, but he knew those trails better than anyone. My chest tightened. I didn't know why, but the name tugged at something in me. Holt was the kind of man who trusted patterns, Pete continued. He knew where the elk favored their winter beds, where the runoff carved new paths each spring, where the cliffs froze last. He didn't scare easy, but one day he came back from patrol pale as drift snow. He didn't sign in, didn't say a word, just walked into his cabin and locked the door. What happened? I asked quietly. Pete's jaw tightened. He'd found something on the ridge, a cave that didn't belong, said he heard something breathing inside it. My skin prickled. Like what I heard? Pete nodded once. Exactly like you heard. He rubbed his face, fingers trembling slightly. We tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't open the door. Wouldn't answer. For 3 days he didn't sleep. We could hear him pacing, talking to himself. Then, Pete's eyes drifted to the floor. Then we woke up one morning and the forest was different. I leaned forward. Different how? The quiet, he whispered. Same quiet you heard before the knocking. Not natural, not emptiness, expectation. Every hair on my arms rose. We went to check on Holt. Door was wide open, no signs of a struggle, but the inside of the cabin was cold, unnaturally cold, like someone had left the window open in the middle of a snowstorm. Only it wasn't just cold, it smelled like stone. My throat tightened. Like a cave? Like something from under a cave, he corrected. The kind of scent that doesn't travel unless something brings it up. I swallowed hard. And Holt? Pete looked at me, and in that long, hollow pause, I already knew the answer. Gone, he said. No footprints, no tracks, no broken branches, just one strange impression in the dirt outside, the same kind of footprint you described, long, narrow at the heel, ridge patterns on the sides. The room felt like it shrank around me. We searched for weeks, he said. Ground teams, dogs, you name it. Nothing. No trail, no scent. It was like the forest swallowed him whole. A tremor ran through my hands. Did anyone else see the creature? Only one, Pete said. A hunter who never came back to these woods said he saw something tall near a cave opening. Said it was standing as still as a boulder with eyes reflecting the moon. Said it looked right through him. He exhaled sharply. We chalked it up to fear, or imagination, or maybe we wanted to. I leaned back, the cabin lights blurring at the edges as everything I'd seen, felt, smelled began aligning into something dangerously coherent. So that's the story? I murmured. Holt found a cave and vanished. That's why you don't go near caves before winter. Pete shook his head. That's not why. That's just the part we talk about. A chill scraped down my spine. The part we don't talk about, he said slowly, is that sometimes the caves don't stay where they were. I blinked. What do you mean? Pete walked to the window, staring at the thinning fog in a way that made it seem like he expected something to walk out of it. Holt's cave wasn't on any map, not even the old ones, but after he vanished, another ranger swore he saw the same opening 3 miles from where Holt had first described it. That doesn't make sense, I whispered. No, Pete agreed. It doesn't. But sense isn't something the forest gives you. Not here. Not with them. The room fell silent. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Then another thought struck me, one I didn't want to voice but couldn't ignore. Has anyone ever gone down into one of those holes? I asked. Pete's eyes met mine with a sharpness that halted my breath. No, he said, because everyone who's gotten close enough to consider it has either disappeared or stopped talking altogether. The words hit like a blow to the chest. I suddenly recalled the pit's cold breath, the perfect circle, the footprints, the creature blocking my retreat, and something else, a detail I had shoved aside in the fear of the moment. When it looked at me, I said quietly, it wasn't confused. It knew I'd been there. It reacted to it. Pete nodded grimly. You stepped near something sacred to them, something territorial. You got close enough to draw attention. He took a deep breath. And attention from them never comes without consequence. I felt the weight of that settle over me, heavier than fear. It wasn't just a warning. It was inevitability. So what do? I asked, my voice deadened. Pete's lips pressed into a thin line. You listen. You follow procedure. Stay in populated areas for a while. Don't patrol alone for a few weeks. Let the forest forget you. Forget me? I echoed. He nodded. Most of the time it does. If you give it space, let the cold pass. I didn't answer. Couldn't. My mind was already slipping back to the ridge, to the darkness I'd glimpsed below, to the way the ground itself seemed to breathe. And then something else weighed on me. Something subtle but sharp. What if I don't want to forget? I whispered before I realized I'd said it aloud. Pete froze. His face took on an expression I couldn't decipher, fear threaded with something else, something like regret or pity or recognition. Mason, he said softly, that's exactly what happened to Holt. The cold in the room deepened. The air pressed against my lungs. Before either of us could speak again, the radio on the wall crackled to life with sudden static. A voice broke through, rushed, strained, nearly swallowed by interference. Emergency call, South Sector, possible cave opening, repeat. Unmapped cave opening, fresh footprints, request immediate. The signal cut sharply. Pete and I stared at each other. Another cave, another opening. And if Holt's story, all the missing pieces of it, meant anything, then these weren't random events. They were movements, patterns, shifts. They're waking, Pete whispered. But he wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for me, because the forest doesn't call someone twice unless it wants something from them. And deep in my bones, where instinct outruns logic, I felt something terrifyingly certain. The pines remembered me, and they weren't finished. We moved before the radio finished its last sputter of static. Pete grabbed his coat, his flashlight, his old revolver, the one he never admitted he carried, and was out the door with a speed that didn't match his age. I followed close behind, the cold air clamping around my face like a warning I could breathe. The forest was awake. Not in the daytime sense, not in the normal rustling leaves and moving shadows way. It was awake like something buried had rolled over beneath us, and the trees were holding their breath, waiting to see what would rise. The silence was worse than night, worse than winter, worse than the moment after the creature snapped the branch. As we headed south, our boots thudded against the frozen ground, each impact louder than it should have been. Pete's voice cut through the air in short bursts, heavy with urgency. "Don't talk unless you have to," he said. "Sound carries wrong near their openings." That word, again, openings. Not caves, not sinkholes. Openings, like doors, like passages. Like something was meant to come through. We crossed a frozen stream that cracked faintly under our weight. Mist hung low over the water, shimmering with a strange density, as though moisture from underground was seeping upward, cold enough to burn. The scent hit me again. Wet stone, deeper this time, fresher, almost metallic. I gagged on instinct. "They're close," Pete muttered. "Closer than I've ever felt." My chest tightened. Before winter. Before the freeze. Before the ground locked them in. We reached the southern sector 30 minutes later, breath raw in our throats, and found 2 rangers waiting, Jenna and Cole. Both pale, both staring at a spot on the forest floor like it was the mouth of something that could swallow them whole. I saw why. The cave opening was bigger than the one I'd found on the ridge. Twice as wide, the edges smoother, almost polished. Steam, or breath if you believe the stories, drifted up in slow spirals, disappearing into the morning air. No animal tracks surrounded it, no collapsed earth, no debris indicating a structural failure. Something had carved it deliberately, as if it knew how the ground wanted to split. Jenna looked at me first. Her voice shook. "It wasn't here yesterday." Cole nodded in quick, twitching movements. "We walked this exact route. No sign of any disturbance." Pete crouched near the edge, his glove hovering over the lip but never touching it. "The air's warm," he whispered. "Warm from deep underground." But when I crouched beside him, I felt the opposite. A cold draft rising from the darkness, sharp enough to sting, cold enough to tighten the skin on my cheeks. Pete yanked his hand back, eyes narrowing like he finally understood some old riddle that terrified him more than ignorance ever had. "They're breathing out heat," he murmured, "but pushing cold up, like they're reversing the air." He looked at me then, and his expression held nothing but dread. "That's how they travel." Jenna stepped back, boots crunching the frost. "There were footprints earlier," she whispered, "before we called it in." "What kind?" Pete asked. Cole swallowed. "Like the ones from Holt's file." The world inside my chest lurched. They had been here. Recently. Maybe still were. Pete stood, voice steady despite the tremor in his breath. "We need to close this off. Set perimeter markers. Call the district office." And nobody gets within 10 feet of... A sound cut him off, a deep, rolling groan. From below, from far, far beneath the earth. The ground trembled lightly. Not enough to knock us off balance, just enough to make the soil pulse beneath our boots. Like a heartbeat. Jenna's hand flew to her mouth. Cole stumbled back. My breath froze mid-exhale. Then came something worse. Footsteps. Not from the trees. From below us. Slow. Heavy. Methodical. Each impact sending a faint vibration through the dirt. Getting closer. Pete grabbed my shoulder. "Back away. Now." We all retreated several steps, flashlights trained on that perfect circle of darkness. The footsteps grew louder, rising through layers of soil like whatever was climbing didn't need a tunnel, didn't need passageways, just space to exist. The air built pressure around my eardrums. The cold intensified. Frost formed on the lip of the opening in an instant. A ring of white blooming like breath crystallized. Something was coming. Then, with a long, low exhale, the footsteps stopped. The silence was so complete, it knocked the breath from my lungs. Then, a hand appeared. Long, pale, thick with fur but shaped unmistakably like a hand. Fingers too long, knuckles too wide, a curved ridge of bone running along the back like an armored plate. It gripped the edge of the opening with a quiet, deliberate strength, pulling something massive upward. Jenna whimpered. Cole turned to run, but Pete barked, "Don't you dare move!" I couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, couldn't think beyond the instinct screaming inside me to flee. The creature's head emerged next, and it wasn't the one I'd seen before. This one was larger, older. Its face seemed carved from stone. Wide, heavy brow, deep-set eyes that caught our lights with a faint, unnatural sheen. Its fur was streaked with mud, the color of riverbeds untouched by sunlight. And when it inhaled, the sound was cavernous, like a centuries-old vault opening its lungs. It scanned the four of us, not with curiosity, with recognition, like it had been waiting. Pete whispered, barely audible, "Don't make eye contact." But it was too late. Its gaze locked onto me, and in that moment I felt something inside my mind shift. A cold pressure, subtle but sure, like fingers touching the back of my thoughts. The forest dimmed, the trees fading into a distant hum. Every part of me, every instinct, every memory, every fear felt tethered to that creature's stare. It wasn't threatening me, it was searching me. Searching my scent, the scent of the first opening, the scent of its territory, the scent of the ridge. Pete moved between us. "Enough," he growled, voice cracking. "Leave him." The creature's gaze lifted, meeting Pete's. It exhaled slowly, the breath curling into a frost spiral. Then another sound emerged, impossibly deep, resonant, vibrating through the ground. A wordless sound, not animal, not human, something older, something that communicated in meaning, not language. Pete's face went white. "Back up, everyone, now." We stepped away slowly, carefully, the creature never breaking its stare. Then, in one fluid motion, it dropped back into the darkness. Not clumsy, not rushed, intentional. Like it had learned what it came for. The ground trembled once more, then stilled. The cold draft stopped. The opening fell silent. Jenna broke first. She inhaled sharply, tears streaming down her face. Cole dropped to his knees, shaking. Pete leaned against a tree, exhausted. Not from running, but from standing between me and something that should never see the surface. I finally found my voice. "What did it want?" Pete answered without looking at me. "You?" The word punched through me. "Why?" I whispered. His eyes lifted, raw and hollow. "Because you stepped near their breath. Because you didn't run when it knocked. Because the forest listened to your fear and knew you'd listen back." He pushed off the tree, stepping closer. "And because you're starting to think like Holt." I wanted to deny it, wanted to say I wasn't like him, that I wasn't drawn in by the mystery, that I didn't feel an ache in my bones, begging me to understand what lived deep beneath these pines. But I did, and Pete saw it. He gripped my arm, hard. "You have to choose, right now, before winter sets in, before the next opening, before the forest decides you belong to it." The woods around us were waking again, the breeze shifting, the trees creaking, the sky widening into pale morning light. I looked at the hole one last time, dark, perfect, waiting. The pines whispered with it. But this time, they were whispering my name. Pete's voice broke the spell. "Mason, decide." And in the cold hush of that forest, with frost climbing the roots and the ground still trembling with the memory of something ancient, I realized something with terrifying clarity. It wasn't just that I had seen the creatures. It was that they had seen me back. And once the pines notice you, they never forget. A strong, emotionally charged opening, introduction, first brush with unease. The first time I heard the pines speak my name, I told myself it was only the wind. That's how I survived that night, by convincing myself the forest was nothing more than a living thing breathing around me, not something shaping words from its own darkness. But looking back now, with years between then and the man I've learned I actually am, I can admit the truth. That whisper wasn't a trick of the mind. It was recognition. My name is not important, not the one my parents gave me anyway. Out here, rangers earn new names, shaped by the woods that judge us. I'm 39 now, stationed in a remote belt of evergreens threading between Idaho and Montana, near a small town where people smile too kindly in daylight and refuse to speak once the sun goes down. They call our forests sacred. They call them haunted. But most often, they call them old, with a seriousness that makes you feel the age of the bark around you. The locals like to say the pines were here before God bothered looking this way, and if you stay long enough, they'll outlive your memory too. I've been a ranger for nearly 2 decades, long enough to know what sounds belong in the understory, long enough to read the language of scat, tracks, broken branches, long enough to know when something is wrong. But I wasn't always this guarded, this cautious. When I arrived here at 24, fresh out of academy training, carrying more confidence than sense, I thought the woods were mine to shape and command. I believed warnings were just the locals' way of testing me, of seeing whether an outsider would bend to their superstitions. Back then, I didn't listen. Now, I listen too closely. My first week on duty, I lived in a small ranger cabin, tucked behind a ridge thick enough with fur that the wind never reached the ground. Nights were colder there, the air heavy with sap and moss, the kind of cold that slips beneath your collar and settles against the bones. I had a wood stove, a cot, and a radio that worked only when the clouds behaved. It was simple living, the kind that reveals your weaknesses before you even realize you have any. Around day 3, small things began to unsettle me. Not enough to worry me, but enough to make me pause. Pine needles arranged too neatly outside my cabin door, as if brushed into pattern rather than scattered naturally. A low groaning sound from the tree line at dusk, deeper than elk, but too rhythmic to be shifting branches. Shadows that clung just a moment longer than the light allowed. I rationalized everything. You have to, otherwise the forest will dismantle you. But unease has a way of building under the skin, slow and patient. It waits. On my 6th night, I was assigned a routine patrol to check a series of old logging roads. Nothing challenging, just a simple loop to ensure hikers weren't wandering too close to the quarry pits. I remember the exact temperature, 37 degrees, crisp enough to keep the insects down, warm enough that my breath didn't fog as much as I expected. A strange comfort, considering the altitude. Clouds were thick, layered like bruised cotton, but a sliver of moonlight still broke through. As I hiked along the second road, the woods quieted around me. Not the gentle hush of night settling in, but the sudden vacuum of everything alive stepping back at once. Birds fell silent. No insects hummed. Even the wind pulled away like it had been sucked from the world. Only the sound of my boots remained, crunch, crunch, echoing too loudly against the muted earth. That was the moment my instincts stirred, a warning, a pressure behind my ribs. But I swallowed the discomfort and pressed forward, telling myself it was just altitude stress. About a mile in, I found the first tracks. They were large, larger than any bare print I'd ever measured. Easily 15 inches deep into the soil, spaced with the stride of something walking upright. The toes were elongated, not rounded, and each one pressed with startling clarity. Whatever made them had weight and purpose. I crouched, ran a gloved hand along the edges. Fresh, no more than an hour old. I should have radioed it in. That was the protocol. But I was young, hungry for validation, so I followed them. The prints led deeper into the pines, weaving between trunks, sometimes vanishing entirely where the ground turned rocky, only to reappear farther ahead. The spacing grew wider as if whatever I was trailing had sensed pursuit and quickened its pace. The silence around me deepened. Then the smell hit, sharp, musky, mixed with something metallic. Blood, but not quite. A rawness like wet iron heating against stone. I slowed my steps. Instinct finally screamed louder than pride. When the knocking began, I froze. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against wood. Not the echo of a branch falling, not the stutter of a winter limb tapping another. This was intentional, hollow, close. Knock, pock, longer pause, knock. I turned in a circle, scanning the tree trunks with my light. My beam caught nothing but bark and shadows. But the sound wasn't random. It followed pattern, like signal or call. A memory flashed, one of the old-timers at the station telling me the forest has its own conversations, its own warnings. That if something wanted you gone, it would ask politely at first. 3 knocks, he'd said, were a request. The second set meant insistence. You never wait for the third. Back then I'd laughed, brushing it off as another tale meant to rattle rookies. But standing alone beneath those towering pines, I understood why no one laughed. The knocks came again, this time closer. Too close. I whispered against my better judgment, "Who's there?" My voice came out thin, swallowed by the thick air. No answer, only stillness. And then just as I took a step back, soft crunches behind me, slow and heavy, matching the rhythm of breath. I whipped around, light slicing through the dark. Again, nothing. But I felt it, the same way you feel a hand hovering near your neck. A presence. Cold. Curious. I didn't run. Running in the woods is suicide. Panic turns roots into traps and shadows into cliffs. So I walked, steady, controlled. Every few steps I listened. The footfalls followed, but faintly, never quite overlapping mine, as if whatever it was wanted me to know it was there, without revealing itself. When I reached the old service road, the normal forest sounds returned all at once. Birds calling, branches rustling, the wind exhaling. The shift nearly buckled my knees. It was like stepping through an invisible barrier, leaving something behind that didn't or couldn't follow. I made it back to the cabin around 2 a.m. I locked the door, lit the stove, sat on the edge of my cot, and told myself I'd simply tracked a bear with an odd gait, spooked by the storm rolling in, that the knocks were some strange echo, that the smell was decomposing carrion. Rationalizations came easy when the fire was warm and the walls were thick. But when I lay down, staring at the cabin ceiling, sleep tugging at my edges, the pines whispered again, my name carried on a current that wasn't wind. A soft, slow stretch of breath that seeped through the cracks and settled beneath my skin. For the first time since arriving, I felt the forest watching me, evaluating me, claiming me. I woke the next morning, pretending nothing had happened. That's what we do when the mind feels the first edges of something it can't process. We don't confront it. We sand it down with routine. I brewed coffee, checked the weather station logs, logged my patrol notes with a deliberate absence of the truth, and convinced myself the whispers from the pines were nothing more than dreams tangled with exhaustion. But avoidance doesn't erase anything out here. It only delays the moment the forest stops asking and starts taking. Around noon, I hiked down to the ranger station to report in person. The station wasn't much, just an aging wooden lodge with a tin roof and a wraparound porch that sagged in 2 corners. But it was where the older rangers gathered, the ones who didn't speak much on the radio because they didn't trust it. Men and women with hands like weathered rope and eyes that seemed to stare through you into something behind. They were kind, but not comforting. They didn't coddle. They didn't offer assurances. They simply existed in the unspoken agreement that the woods were bigger than all of us. When I walked in, my supervisor glanced up from a stack of field journals. He didn't smile. He rarely did. "You look pale," he muttered. "Altitude getting to you?" "Didn't sleep well," I said. My voice cracked from a dryness in my throat that felt like fear clothed in dust. "Heard odd noises." He paused, pen frozen mid-stroke. "What kind of noises?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound foolish. "Knocking." He lowered the pen slowly. "How many?" I shrugged. 3. He exhaled through his nose, a barely audible sound, but waited with meaning. "Where were you?" "Logging Road 2, about a mile past the quarry fork." Silence stretched, deep and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke again. "Locals don't go near that area after dark. Neither should you." My skin prickled. "Because of bears?" He looked at me like he was deciding how much I could be trusted with. "Because things mimic out there." I felt the words like a cold draft crawling down my spine. Before I could ask what he meant, another ranger, a tall woman named Hart, whose face always looked carved from stone, spoke from the corner. "Did it follow you?" I swallowed. "I don't think so." "You'd know," she said quietly. No one elaborated, and I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to hear the answer. I returned to my cabin with my confidence chiseled down to something brittle. I kept busy for hours, cleaning gear that wasn't dirty, rechecking maps I already knew by heart, sharpening tools that didn't need sharpening. But even with the stove crackling and daylight spilling across the floorboards, I couldn't shake the sense that something had turned its attention toward me. By late afternoon, clouds thickened and lowered themselves between the trees like slow drifting blankets. The temperature dropped sharply. A storm was forming, cold, heavy, and windless. The kind of weather locals claimed the forest used to hide things it didn't want seen. I stepped outside to gather more firewood, but the moment I crossed the threshold, I paused. The woods were unnaturally still again. Too still. Still. The air felt suspended, like the world paused mid-breath. Then I smelled it, just faintly at first. A musk, thick and animal-like, threaded with that unsettling metallic tang from the night before. My jaw clenched. The scent didn't drift on the breeze. It was stationary, waiting. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. But the feeling returned. That pressure, like a large shape, crouched just beyond sight. I stacked the firewood and retreated inside, shutting the door with more force than necessary. My hands shook slightly. Not from cold, from the creeping acceptance that something from the night before hadn't forgotten me. Night came fast with the storm. Darkness pooled quickly, swallowing the forest floor. Rain didn't fall. The clouds simply hung low, thickening the night into something nearly tactile. I kept the lantern burning, not because I needed it, but because I felt watched. By 10, I forced myself to try sleeping. The wind pressed against the cabin walls in slow, testing pushes. Not the usual frantic gusts, just steady, deliberate pressure, like something trying to understand the structure. Around 1 in the morning, something tapped on my window. A single tap. Sharp. Clear. Not from settling wood, not from wind. My eyes snapped open. A second tap, exactly the same. I sat up slowly, breath tight, listening. Third tap. 3 again. The same pattern. I didn't approach the window. I didn't want to know what silhouette might be standing beyond that thin pane of glass. Instead, I whispered into the darkness, "Go away." My breath fogged faintly in the cold air, unusual inside the cabin. The temperature had dropped dramatically. Then something scraped along the wooden wall, slow, dragging like the tip of a branch or a finger tracing the grains. The sound traveled from one end of the cabin to the other. My pulse hammered. Every instinct screamed not to investigate. The scratching paused. Silence stretched. Then from the back door, 3 heavy thuds. Not knocks. Fists. I stood, chest tightening painfully, and stepped back until I felt the bed frame press against my legs. The lantern flickered. The air suddenly smelled like damp fur and old blood. Another set of 3 thuds shook the door. I could hear breathing now, deep, ragged, wet, each exhale thick enough to fog the cold air. I had my sidearm, but guns don't stop everything we fear. They don't stop things made of shadow and muscle and something older than evolution. The latch began to rattle. Gentle at first, then harder, then violently. I drew the gun, hands trembling despite my training. My voice barely cracked out. I'm armed. The rattling stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. Because in that stillness, I heard footsteps. Not footsteps approaching, but footsteps walking around the cabin. Slow, circling. The boards creaked softly at the edges of the foundation as the weight shifted around me. Once, twice, again. It was inspecting the cabin, charting its entrances, measuring me. When it reached the front corner nearest my bed, the breathing grew louder, so close it felt like the wood between us barely existed. And then, with a suddenness that tore the air open, something slammed into the wall, hard. The whole cabin shook. I stumbled backward, heart racing, gun raised. The impact came again, this time with a sound beneath it, a growl, deep, guttural, resonant enough to vibrate through the floorboards. Not a bear, not any animal I knew, something else. I backed into the kitchen area, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the counter. It wasn't much, but it felt like some kind of anchor. Then, silence. Total, impossible silence. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 2. Nothing. The breathing stopped. The circling stopped. The scent faded. I stood frozen until dawn seeped through the cabin window, pale and cold. When I finally stepped outside, the ground around the cabin was torn with massive footprints, those same elongated toes pressed deep into the softened earth. But this time, each set of tracks faced directly toward the cabin walls, as if it had stood inches away, watching me, studying me, claiming its interest. I radioed the station, but the call crackled with interference. A voice finally broke through, hearts low and flat. "You're marked now," she said. "Whatever you did out there, it noticed." I wanted to argue. I wanted to deny it. But deep down, I already knew the truth. The forest hadn't just whispered my name, it had chosen me. I didn't leave my cabin for hours after Hart's message. Her words clung to me like frost, settling in the places I didn't want to acknowledge. Marked. In ranger terms, that meant something had taken notice, and once the forest takes notice, it rarely looks away. By mid-morning, the storm had broken. Weak sunlight filtered through thinning clouds, casting a pale sheen over the pines. Normally, that light would have brought relief, but that day, it only sharpened the fear lingering along my nerves. The trees looked different, taller, leaner, angled as if listening. I forced myself to walk the perimeter of the cabin, needing to see the tracks again in daylight. And when I did, something tightened in my chest. The prints were even clearer now, imprinted deep into the softened earth. Large, upright, heavy, but there was something else. Long drag lines behind a few of them, as though the creature's arms or hands nearly grazed the ground. Whatever watched me last night wasn't just curious. It was close enough to touch the walls, close enough to inhale the warmth bleeding from the cracks, close enough to smell me. I crouched beside the largest track, measuring its depth with my palm hovering above it. Nearly 4 inches deep. That wasn't weight alone. That was intention. Each step driven down with controlled pressure, like something testing the ground, feeling the earth respond. For the first time since joining the service, I felt utterly outmatched. The forest wasn't my terrain anymore. I wasn't a ranger here. I was prey that had been spared for reasons I didn't understand. When I made it back inside, the cabin felt smaller than ever. My supervisor's voice crackled over the radio, distorted but recognizable. "You got activity near your post?" I hesitated. "Yes." "Describe it." I looked around the cabin, suddenly aware of how fragile it was. Thin walls, aging locks, glass windows that could shatter under a mild shove. It wasn't the place to speak truth aloud. Something big, bipedal, smart enough to test the cabin. Silence. Then a static-filled sigh. "You need to come down to the station. Now." I packed quickly. Radio, map, flashlight, sidearm, extra batteries. My hands shook once, then steadied. Fear can do that. Offer a moment of clarity before the real panic takes over. Stepping outside, the woods felt wrong again. The quiet wasn't the normal morning stillness. It was a held breath, a tightened coil. I had 2 miles to hike. 2 miles through dense timber where sunlight filtered only in fractured strips. Every crunch of pine needles beneath my boots felt amplified, echoing too far, too loudly. And though I didn't hear footsteps behind me, I felt them. Presence isn't always sound. It's pressure, displacement, the subtle shift of air when something large shares it with you. Half a mile in, I stopped abruptly. Something had changed. The scent. It hit me the same way it had that first night, a sharp musk laced with wet fur and iron. But it wasn't faint this time. It was fresh, strong. Ahead of me, I raised the flashlight and swept the trees in slow arcs. Nothing. No movement. No shadow that didn't belong. But the smell lingered, heavy as fog. Then the knocking began again, not from the side, not from behind, from directly ahead. 3 slow knocks against wood, not close enough to see, but close enough to know it wasn't natural. I clenched my jaw. "I'm not running," I whispered to myself. "Not today." But my body disagreed. My heart pounded against my ribs, heavy enough to hurt. My breathing quickened. The air thickened, dense like syrup. The knocks came again, but this time the rhythm changed. Knock, 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 knock. Almost like a sequence, a pattern, communicative. Everything inside me tensed. Something wasn't mimicking anymore. It was signaling. I stepped backwards slowly, careful not to snap a branch or skid on loose soil. The smell grew stronger. My instincts screamed to retreat, but the forest behind me felt just as dangerous as the direction of the knocking. Then to my right, something exhaled. Loud, wet. My blood froze. I didn't turn fully. Turning your back on something you don't understand is the surest way to die in the woods. Instead, I shifted slightly, enough to glimpse a dark shape between the trees. Tall, broader than any bear, too still to be animal, too silent to be human. The outline swayed gently, like it was breathing, or swaying in thought. My throat tightened, my legs threatened to buckle. "Easy," I whispered, not to it but to myself. Another exhale, lower this time, almost curious. I raised my sidearm, though fear had already hollowed its usefulness. Back off, I said quietly. My voice cracked. The shape didn't move, but its presence pressed harder, an invisible weight like a cold palm against my sternum. Then, from behind me, a new sound, branches snapping, something large stepping on them with no attempt at stealth. My skin flushed with a cold wave of realization. There were two of them, one ahead, one behind, flanking me. Panic took over. Not the erratic kind that makes you run blindly, but the sharp, primal instinct that forces your body into action. I pivoted left, between the two presences, and bolted down the slope toward the creek. Not up the trail, not toward the open road. Toward water. Because predators, human or not, slow down near unstable footing. My boots skidded over moss, my breath tearing through my throat. Branches whipped my arms, my legs burned. But the sounds behind me grew louder, heavy strides, breaking underbrush that shouldn't break so easily. I didn't dare look back. Some truths are worse when seen. The creek came into view, a narrow slash of running water cutting through the undergrowth. I jumped the last 3 feet of embankment, landed awkwardly, and splashed knee-deep into the icy current. The cold stabbed up my legs, but the forest behind me halted. The footsteps stopped instantly. The shapes did not follow. I stood there in the freezing water, chest heaving, teeth chattering not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash. Slowly, I turned. The woods were empty, utterly still, no movement. But I knew, absolutely knew, they were there, watching, waiting, testing my boundary. And the boundary, apparently, was water. I stayed in the creek until my legs went numb, then followed it downstream until the ranger station came into view. When I stepped onto the porch, soaked and shaking, Hart met me with a look I'd never seen on her face before. Not judgment, not irritation, concern. "You shouldn't have walked alone," she said. My voice trembled. "They followed me." She nodded once, slowly. "They do that with the marked ones." Inside, my supervisor cleared a table and motioned for me to sit. He spread a laminated topographic map between us, tapping an area with deep valleys and dense timber. "This is where you were," he said. "This is where the knocks came from. And these," he tapped a shaded region farther north, "are where the locals won't hunt, hike, or even speak about." I studied the map. My hands shook uncontrollably. "What are they? What did I see?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at me with the tired expression of someone who'd carried too many secrets too long. "We don't use names," he said quietly. "Not for them." Hart crossed her arms. "Names make things real. And some things out here become more real the moment you give them that power." My breath trembled. "Why me?" My supervisor leaned back. "Because you followed their tracks. Because you didn't respect the knocking. Because you made yourself visible." I stared at the map, heart sinking. "Visible. Marked. Tracked. You said they mimic," I whispered. "Why? For what?" Hart answered this time, her voice low and steady. "To learn. To learn you. To understand your fear." "And then?" "They choose what to do with you." A shiver crawled up my spine that no amount of warmth could chase away. I had entered their forest, and they had responded, not with violence, not with hunger, but with awareness, and awareness is always the beginning of something worse. Section 3 complete. Say continue when you're ready for Section 4, 1,100 using 300 words. Haber Section 4, 1,200 words, continuing seamlessly from Section 3, deepening fear, entering the anthology arc. My supervisor folded the map closed as if shutting the truth back inside it. But the truth was already out. It had followed me down the ridge, paced behind me in the dark, breathed against my cabin walls, and learned my footsteps in the soil. Closing a map wasn't going to change anything. "We're not sending you back to your cabin tonight," he said. "You'll sleep here, in the station. Strength in numbers." Hart scoffed. "Numbers don't matter when they want someone." I shot her a look, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was telling me the part everyone else wanted to soften. The reality was, even with the lights on, even with other rangers nearby, the air inside the station felt too thin to breathe. The The station had always been a haven in my mind. Thick logs, heavy doors, wood stove humming in the corner. But now it felt permeable, fragile. A barrier that meant very little to something standing 7 feet tall with hands large enough to leave grooves in pine. My supervisor tried to change the subject, handing me a warm mug of something earthy and bitter. "Sit," he said. "We need to talk about patterns." I sat, my fingers wrapped tight around the mug like it was the only solid thing left in the world. He pulled out a notebook so worn the edges had curled into the shape of his grip. "Every ranger who encounters them goes through phases," he said. "It starts with knocking, always knocking, a courtesy, a warning." Hart leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Some get only one night of knocks, some get weeks." My stomach tightened. "And after the knocking?" My supervisor's eyes flicked to me, burdened with something like grief. "Then they start showing themselves. Not fully, not directly. They let you see just enough to understand you're not imagining anything." I thought of the silhouette in the trees that morning, the sway of its shape, the depth of its breath. My skin prickled all over. "I saw one," I said softly. "At least, its outline." Hart's jaw twitched. "Then you're already past phase 2. A chill grounded itself in my bones. "What's phase 3? Neither answered right away. My supervisor closed the notebook and put it aside like its weight had suddenly increased. He finally said, "They start guiding you." Hart pushed off the doorframe sharply. "He's not ready for that conversation." "He deserves the truth," my supervisor said. I leaned forward slowly. "Guiding me where?" He didn't look at me when he said it. "Into their territory." A hollow feeling opened in my chest. "Why would they want me there?" He sighed. "Because that's where they keep what they don't want found." I sat back, heart sinking. I didn't know if he meant objects, bodies, secrets, or something worse. I didn't ask. Not yet. Night settled outside the station with a heaviness that pressed against the windows. The clouds thickened again. The air grew dense. Every instinct told me something was building, gathering in the pines like a storm no one had prepared for. The senior rangers took turns patrolling the perimeter. Hart circled the building twice before returning inside, shaking off her jacket. "They're close," she muttered. "The woods feel hollow." No one questioned her. Everyone understood the language of absence. By midnight, the wood stove had died down to embers. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion has a way of taking you even when fear tries to keep your eyes open. My dreams were shallow things, flashes of dark shapes, echoing knocks, the scent of damp fur. But at some point, something changed. The dream sharpened, focused. In the dark of half-sleep, I heard my name spoken softly, not screamed, not growled, whispered. I jerked awake, heart stumbling in my chest. Hart, already awake, looked at me from the chair across the room. "You heard it," she said quietly. My voice shook. "How did you know?" "It always starts with whispers once they've chosen someone." She leaned closer. "That's how they get inside, not through doors, through doubt." A crack sounded outside, sharp, snapping wood. Every ranger stiffened, another crack. Closer, deliberate. My supervisor grabbed a lantern and nodded toward the back window. "Lights stay low, no sudden movements." We approached the window like it was a cliff edge. Hart pulled aside the curtain just an inch. Her breath hitched. I leaned in beside her. In the glow of thin moonlight, something stood at the tree line, a towering silhouette, still and straight as a dead pine. Its outline was unmistakable, shoulders too broad, arms too long, head tilting with an uncanny patience. It wasn't hiding. It wanted to be seen. My stomach twisted. Heat flushed through me, then drained back out like it was being pulled from beneath my skin. We watched it for nearly a minute, but time felt distorted, stretching, tightening, looping. My breath stayed shallow, almost non-existent. Then, slowly, it raised its arm. Not a wave, a beckoning. My legs went weak. "They want him to follow," Hart whispered. My supervisor clenched his jaw. "They're starting sooner than expected." My throat dried. "Expected?" Hart turned to me. "This isn't the first time a ranger's been marked. It's just been a long time since the last one." A rustle echoed outside. leaves shifting, branches swaying, not from wind, but from something moving behind the silhouette. Others. More than one. Maybe more than two. The figure lowered its arm and stepped backward into the trees. As soon as it disappeared, the forest swallowed the movement. Silence returned with crushing finality. Hart's voice was rough. It's only going to escalate from here. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, skin clammy. I'm not going back out there, I whispered. My supervisor met my eyes with a sympathy so rare it unsettled me. You won't have a choice. I sat heavily on the bench beside the wood stove, every muscle trembling. The station no longer felt safe. Now it felt like a temporary pause in something much larger, a thin wall of human wood and nails holding back something ancient and patient. Hart approached, crouching beside me. You need to understand something, she said. They don't chase people for fun. They don't torment for entertainment. I swallowed hard. Then why me? She considered me for a long moment, her eyes softening just slightly. Because you heard them. Most people never do. Most people walk through the woods deaf to the things beneath the surface. But you listened, maybe without meaning to, maybe only for a second. But the moment you listened, they answered. And now, she said, they want to know what else you're capable of hearing. A tremor spread through my chest. Footsteps sounded on the porch, slow, heavy, not even pretending to be stealthy. Every ranger tensed. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then a single knock. Not three, one, sharp, final. Hart stood, pale as bark. That's not a warning. That's a summons. My blood turned cold. Summons, I whispered. My supervisor didn't sugarcoat it. They want you to see something. A hollow ache formed in my stomach, a dread deeper than any fear I had felt in the woods. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The entire station seemed to wait. Hart put a hand on my shoulder. Whatever happens next, you walk toward it. I won't, I muttered weakly. You will, she said, because not going is worse. The lantern's flame flickered violently, then steadied as if inhaling. Outside, the knock came again, 2 short taps this time, like punctuation. They were losing patience. The second knock felt different, sharper, less patient, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. My supervisor exchanged a grave look with Hart, then reached for the lantern again. We're stepping outside, he said. All of us. My stomach lurched. I'm not going out there. Hart crouched in front of me, her eyes steady and unblinking. Listen, no one's handing you over. No one's sacrificing you. We stay with you, but you have to step out that door. If you hide from a summons, you hand them control. My breathing came fast now. Too fast. Why me? Why do this to me? Because you're the one they noticed, she said. And if you don't answer, they'll break the walls down to get your attention. The words hit with a weight that suppressed every argument I wanted to make. The knocking outside, so deliberate, so exact, wasn't just at the door. It was in my chest, under my ribs, tightening something that hadn't fully snapped yet. My supervisor nodded toward the back door. Lanterns low, stay tight. The other 2 rangers in the station rose as well, quiet, focused, an unspoken pact moving between them. They weren't afraid of the woods the same way I was, but I could tell they respected it, deeply, like a force that punished disrespect in ways human law never could. When I stood, my legs nearly buckled. Hart gripped my arm until I steadied. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Outside, the air pressed against us like a physical thing. Heavy, thick, saturated with moisture and an underlying scent, one I recognized instantly. Wet fur, earth, iron. It wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It blanketed the clearing. The rangers formed a loose circle around me as my supervisor opened the station door. The beam of his lantern cut a narrow tunnel of light into the darkness, but the shadows didn't retreat. They seemed to inhale it, swallowing the glow at the edges. The porch boards creaked under our weight. The night felt alive in an unsettling, predatory way. Stay close, Hart whispered. I stepped outside. The silence was immense, a full-bodied quiet that pressed gently against the ears, muting even my own breath. It was the kind of quiet that suggested listening, not absence. They were here, watching. The Rangers' lanterns flickered as though disturbed by something unseen passing between them. My pulse hammered, my skin prickled. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to lock myself inside, to never open that door again. But instinct wasn't in control anymore. Something else was. We descended the porch steps slowly, boots sinking into damp soil. The night seemed to shift around us, not growing darker, but compressing, tightening the circle of visibility until the trees felt inches away. I had walked these woods hundreds of times, even in pitch black, and never felt claustrophobic, but tonight I felt enclosed. More knocks echoed, not at the cabin now, but far deeper in the tree line. 3 spaced evenly. A direction. A call. "Follow it," my supervisor said softly. Thunder cracked in my chest. "Are you serious?" He didn't respond with reassurance or dismissal. Only truth. "If you don't, they'll bring what they want to show you straight to us. Trust me, you don't want that." Another trio of knocks. Everything in me rebelled. "Why are they knocking? What does it mean?" Hart answered, voice low. "They knock because it was once a human signal, long before any of us were out here. They imitate what we understand. It's an invitation and a boundary. It's the only courtesy they give." "And if I ignore it?" Her expression hardened. "Then they stop giving courtesy." The forest inhaled around us, then exhaled. A warm gust of air rolled through the pines, unnatural in temperature, like the breath of something huge. I turned toward the sound of the last knock. It came from deep in the old growth section where the pines thickened, where even hunters avoided walking after dusk. A narrow path opened between 2 massive trunks, not a trail but the suggestion of one. A corridor into deeper shadow. Hart stepped beside me. "You're not alone. We go with you." My supervisor nodded. "But you lead." Cold crept up my spine. They were being honest, brutally honest. This path was mine to walk. They could accompany me, but they couldn't shield me. The idea of stepping into that corridor made my bones ache. Fear wasn't a surface emotion anymore. It had become a weight beneath my ribs, a presence of its own. But some part of me, something old, some instinct beyond fight or flight, pulled me forward. So I walked. The Rangers flanked me, lanterns low, beams trembling across the earth. The forest swallowed us in seconds. The air cooled sharply, moisture gathered on my skin. The trees loomed high enough to block the moon, leaving only scattered glimmers of light between their needles. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sounds began. Not footsteps, not breath. Knocking, dozens of knocks. Not from one direction, but from everywhere. Different distances, different rhythms. Some deep, like fist on trunk. Some rapid, like knuckles on hollow bark. Heart stiffened. "They're surrounding us." My supervisor whispered, "Stay calm, keep walking." But the knocks grew louder, overlapping, cascading over each other like drum beats in a collapsing hall. Knock, knock. 3 knocks. A single thud, a rapid tapping, a low, slow pounding. My scalp tingled, my vision tunneled. The air was suddenly thick with scent. Strong, pungent, overwhelming. Every memory of the smell from my cabin crashed into me at once. Then, ahead of us, something moved. A shape. Tall. Massive. Its outline almost identical to the silhouette I'd seen earlier, but now closer. Too close. It didn't approach. It waited. The Rangers stopped behind me, but no one said a word. They knew this wasn't their moment. My supervisor whispered, "That's the one who called you." My mouth went dry. "Why me?" "Because it remembers you," Hart said. "The night you followed its tracks, you crossed its path. You showed curiosity. They don't forget curiosity." The figure shifted, not stepping forward, but turning slightly, as if revealing the slope of its head, the breadth of its chest. Lantern light flickered over it, but the shadows seemed to cling tighter, refusing to reveal full detail. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my teeth. Then it raised its arm and pointed. Not at me, but past me, behind us. Slowly I turned. A second figure stood between 2 old pines, watching silently. Its shoulders rose and fell with slow, deep breaths, then a third, a fourth. The clearing around us filled with silhouettes, some massive, some slightly smaller, but all standing unnaturally still. Hart's breath hitched. My supervisor muttered a curse under his breath. "They're out in the open," he whispered. "All of them." What does that mean? I asked, my voice cracking. Hart's jaw tightened. It means this isn't a warning anymore. My stomach dropped. Then what is it? The first figure lowered its arm and stepped aside, revealing something behind it, a narrow dip in the earth, partially hidden by roots and moss. A hole. No, a passage. A downward slope, almost like the mouth of a cave swallowed by pine roots. My supervisor exhaled shakily. They want to show you where they came from. No, Hart muttered. Not where they came from. What they protect. A cold gust cut through my jacket, slicing along my spine. The entrance was small, just large enough for a man to crawl into on hands and knees, darker than the forest around it, older than the trees above. A wound in the earth. My throat tightened. What's in there? My supervisor swallowed. Buried things. Hart's voice was barely audible. Secrets this forest has carried for longer than humans have walked here. I stared at the hole, feeling its darkness reach toward me. The figures watched in total silence, not forcing, not threatening, waiting. Hart put a hand on my shoulder. This is the part every marked ranger faces. The question isn't whether you go in. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. It's what you bring back out. The forest inhaled and the cave exhaled. The breath from the cave was warm. Not the comforting warmth of earth that had held the sun all day, but something older, moist, slow, alive. It brushed across my face like an exhale meant just for me. My knees weakened. My thoughts scattered. Some primitive part of me understood instantly. Nothing human had ever willingly crawled into this place and emerged unchanged. Behind me, the silhouettes waited in perfect stillness. In front of me, the cave waited like a mouth. Small, dark, pulsing with the faintest suggestion of movement deeper inside. Hart leaned close. Whatever's down there, you don't look at it, you witness it. There's a difference. My supervisor's lantern flickered, the glow thinning as if something inside the cave drew the light inward. Once you enter, you keep your breathing slow. If you panic, you'll get lost, even if you don't move an inch. I don't want to do this, I whispered. Hart's hand tightened on my shoulder. Nobody ever does. The first figure, the one who beckoned me earlier, shifted its weight. Just that subtle pressure of movement pushed me forward another step. My boots sank slightly into the soil, softer here, more disturbed. You're not alone, Hart murmured. But I was. The moment I knelt at the cave entrance, the forest behind me felt distant, muffled, like sinking beneath water. The lanterns dimmed at my back. The knocks stopped. The silhouettes did not breathe. Then the cave inhaled again, gentle, slow, inviting. I lowered myself onto my hands and knees. The roots around the entrance curled like fingers woven through the soil, guiding me down. The earth smelled of sap and stone and something else, something metallic and dusty, like the remnants of forgotten tools or old relics. My shoulders brushed the ceiling. The narrow passage swallowed me whole. Hart's voice echoed faintly behind me. Slow breaths. I crawled. The darkness thickened fast, swallowing the last of the lantern's glow. The ground sloped downward, uneven and damp. Roots brushed against my arms. Water dripped somewhere ahead, slow, rhythmic. With every inch, the warm air grew thicker, coating my throat with a strange taste. Not unpleasant, but heavy, like breath layered with memory. The passage opened slightly, just enough for me to crouch instead of crawl. My fingers grazed carvings on the walls, lines, grooves, symbols that felt intentional but not human. They spiraled, intersected, bent in ways geometry didn't prefer. The deeper I went, the more the silence took on its own texture. Until suddenly, it wasn't silent. I heard whispers, not words. Breaths shaped like meaning, soft overlappings like layered like multiple versions of the same voice speaking from different places. They didn't frighten me immediately. The whispers weren't malicious. They were mournful, curious, sorrowful, even. My heartbeat slowed. The panic eased, replaced by a strange, dreamlike clarity. The cave no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a confession. I reached a chamber, a hollow space carved by nature or something else into a rough sphere. Dim light seeped from cracks in the walls as a faint bioluminescence that painted everything in pale green, enough to see shapes, bones, Not human, not animal, I recognized. Long femurs with double joints, rib cages wider than a person's outstretched arms, fragments of skulls with crests, clawed hands with too many knuckles. My breath caught. These were not creatures of myth. They had been real. And they had died. All around me, the cave wall held marks, claw-shaped, deep, gouging. The chamber was not a burial site. It was a place of struggle, of fear. The whispers grew louder suddenly, not around me, but inside me, echoing across the hollow space of my mind. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound didn't stop. It vibrated under my skull, a pulse of desperation, sobbing, pleading. Then I understood. They weren't trying to scare me. They were showing me what they feared. The forest wasn't warning me about themselves. They were warning me about something deeper, something below. A tremor shook the chamber, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated the walls. Dust drifted from overhead. A few pebbles clattered at my feet. My throat tightened. "Heart," I called softly, hardly above a whisper. The tunnel behind me stayed dark. Another tremor rolled through the chamber, and beneath the sound, beneath the shifting stones, a second noise. A scraping. Slow. Massive. Something moving deeper below, behind the walls, under the floor. My breath froze. My skin chilled. The silhouettes above weren't guarding the cave. They were guarding what the cave was holding back. I stumbled toward the tunnel, adrenaline crushing the trance the whispers had drawn me into. As I crawled upward, the walls tightened again. Roots snagged my jacket. Soil crumbled under my palms. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by another breath. Louder. Not an exhale. An inhalation. A deep, powerful pull of air from behind me, like something vast drawing its first breath in centuries. "Move," I hissed to myself, scrambling upward. The tunnel shuddered. Dirt fell in clumps. A crack formed along the wall. Then the knock echoed from behind me. Not three, just one. But not from the creatures above. This knock was deeper. A slow resonance that shook the earth like a heartbeat. Something older, something waking. I clawed upward, lungs burning. The weight of the earth pressed down as if fighting to keep me where I was. My vision blurred. The tunnel warped. My knees scraped raw against the stone. "Keep moving." Hart's voice echoed faintly from above, farther than I expected. Too far. A rush of air exploded upward behind me, hot, pungent, ancient. It roared through the tunnel like a beast forcing breath into a world it should never have returned to. The cave exhaled. I screamed and lunged upward, fingers clawing at roots like boots slipping on loose soil. The tunnel narrowed, squeezed, then widened into the night. Hands seized me, Hearts, my supervisors, the others, dragging me out as the cave behind me convulsed. A rumble surged from below. Soil collapsed inward. The mouth of the tunnel sank several inches. A gust of foul, humid wind blasted upward, knocking us backward. The silhouettes in the trees stepped closer, not threatening, but forming a barrier. Between us and the collapse. Between us and whatever had stirred beneath. The first figure, the tall one who'd summoned me, lowered its head. A gesture that didn't feel like dominance. It felt like gratitude. Behind it, dozens more shapes emerged. Some standing tall, others hunched, all watching with a strange, heavy solemnity. The ground shuddered once more, then stopped. The forest held its breath. The knocking ceased. The whispers faded. The silhouettes slowly stepped back into the deeper gloom, one by one, dissolving between the pines as though the night itself absorbed them. Within moments, the woods were empty again. Only the cave entrance remained, partially collapsed, sealed by earth and roots, as if the forest itself had closed a wound. My chest heaved. My hands shook violently. Hart steadied me, her palm firm against my back. "You saw it," she whispered. "Not a question." I nodded slowly, my voice barely forming. "They weren't trying to claim me." "No," she said softly. "They were trying to prepare you." "For what?" My supervisor answered this time, his voice low and burdened. "For the day that thing finishes waking up." A coldness spread through me. What was down there? He looked out at the pines, eyes hollow with years of knowing too much. Something the forest has been drowning in roots and silence for longer than memory, something that shouldn't breathe, but does. And the creatures, the ones who followed me, they're not the danger. Fly, Hart said, her voice steady. They're the warning. The sky began to lighten, not with dawn, but with a pale shimmer behind the clouds, a softness, a return to the living world. My pulse calmed, my breath steadied. The knocking was gone. But the forest had changed, because I had changed. As we walked back to the station, my supervisor glanced at me. You understand why they chose you now? No, I whispered. You listened, he said. Most people walk through this world deaf. You didn't. And once the forest knows you can hear it, it doesn't let you ignore it. I looked back toward the trees, dark, immense, whispering secrets beneath their breath. For the first time, I didn't feel hunted. I felt responsible. Because there are spirits in the pines, some wandering, some watching, some warning, and now they knew my name. And I finally understood what the locals meant when they said the forest was old enough to remember, old enough to choose, old enough to whisper back.